Welcome to the Develop Yourself podcast, where we teach you everything you need to land your first job as a software developer by developing yourself, developing your skills, your network, your habits, and more. I'm your host, Aaron Hayslip, and today we're going to be talking with Peter Elbaum. Peter graduated from a Coding Bootcamp in 2016 and quickly found himself working as a senior software engineer just a few years after starting. As you'll hear in this interview, Peter is passionate about teaching others how to do the same, and he does so on his own YouTube channel, which, side note, just hit 1,000 subscribers, in addition to indie hacking, which we'll define in a bit. But ultimately, he's passionate about being available for his family. After all, coding is great, but as Peter explains in this interview, it's ultimately not what matters most. I hope you enjoy your time here with Peter. Oh, and as a side note here, as this episode is coming out on November 22nd, and we never do advertisements, I wanted to let y'all know that this Friday, November 26th, the day after Thanksgiving, is a deadline for our online code school, Parsity. You can pay the early deposit to hold your spot. There's literally only 2 spots left at the time of this recording, so I'm not sure there's going to be any space. But paying that deposit will hold your spot in the program. So you can go through our prep course, which you can do for free if you pay the deposit. So you can learn the basics of JavaScript, which you need in order to pass the code challenge, which you have to do in order to gain admissions to the January 17th, 2022 program that we have. And if you can't pass the code challenge at the end of the prep course, then we'll give you our deposit back. All right, now here's Peter. Peter, thanks, man, so much for joining the podcast. I'm going to give a little bit of background on how I know you, and then I'll probably ask you to back up and tell us the story about how you became a software engineer. So I met you kind of randomly, and I don't remember your side of the story, or I don't know your side of the story, obviously, but I feel like you reached out to me, luckily enough, whenever I moved to Durham, and we were starting Project Shift, which was the in-person code school. And then you had, I think, maybe just finished the Iron Yard, and you were like working for, I think, the city of Raleigh, right? I just remember you like doing Angular, I think.
Yeah. So the way I remember that is that the Project Shift Twitter actually followed me. And so I started clicking around and looking at the website, and I guess discerned enough about what you were up to, thought it'd be interesting to connect. And so I reached out that way. And yeah, at that point I was at the city of Raleigh. Funnily enough, people don't really think about local government as a place where programmers live, certainly not for a first job, but that's kind of what the deal was at that point, and that's how we met.
That's so funny. Yeah, and then, by the way, I think I was desperate for connect with anybody because I had just moved here. We were living abroad, so I was tickled to death that someone else wanted to hang out. And then since then, you've been along kind of helping out in a lot of ways with our community, which has been really a huge blessing for me as a mentor. Recently with Parsity, you've been grading our evals. Now you're about to help out a little bit more with some of our student progress stuff. But I think what would be helpful to get from you, as we were talking about before we started recording, was, tell me about your journey from basically. I like to start back to the decision point of, hey, maybe I'm going to enroll in a coding bootcamp, all the way through to probably, landing that first job at the city of Raleigh. What would that process look like?
Yeah. So I think it's probably helpful for a little bit more context before deciding to go to bootcamp. So just really quickly, in high school, I fell in love with Spanish and entered college wanting to be a linguistics professor. But the college I went to didn't have linguistics as a major, so that was kind of red flag number one, I guess. But after college, I didn't really know what I wanted to do because I kind of abandoned the professor dream along the way and had developed a lot of other interests. And so what do you do with a Spanish degree? Usually either move to a Spanish-speaking country and teach English or stay here and teach Spanish. So I taught Spanish at a private high school in Atlanta for a year. And then I was in foster care for a year, which was really difficult. And during that year, I was kind of really floundering and just feeling like I didn't have much purpose or direction, felt like I really needed a career path. And luckily enough, I had an aunt who worked in the tech industry in Boston. And at that point, coding boot camps were still pretty new, but they started in the bigger cities. And so she was aware of coding boot camps and kind of suggested that I consider enrolling in one. But we had that conversation when I was finishing up teaching. So it took a whole nother year after that for me to kind of make the decision. But during that year when I was doing foster care, I was just trying to figure out what is the next step going to be? What is my career going to be? And I ended up doing a lot of research. Thankfully, at that point, I was living in a city that had a coding boot camp, the Iron Yard, like you mentioned, and Greenville, South Carolina was the city, and it happened to be the headquarters. So not only was the boot camp there, but also all the people that worked for the company itself were working there for the most part. And so I just had a lot of opportunity to kind of go to demo days and talk to past students. And so I ended up doing a lot of research because of how expensive it was at the time. I really wanted to make sure that I kind of had my ducks in a row and knew what I was getting into. And so I went. At that point, it was fall 2016. And the way the Iron Yard worked was you did front end or back end. So I know, for example, Parsley's curriculum is full stack. Most curriculums at this point, I'd say, are full stack.
Yeah.
But you had to pick one or the other. And I felt like, I don't know why I picked front end. I guess I felt like it would be rewarding to see kind of instantaneous changes and have more of a direct interaction with the user. And so we learned a lot of stuff. I remember it was a really stressful time just because, so many new concepts. I was very aware that I had taken all this money out to do this program and felt like I've got to make it through this so that I can get a job, at least so I can pay this loan back. So I kind of unnecessarily put a lot of pressure on myself instead of just focusing on the learning. So that was kind of one big takeaway from that. But
just cut in real quick. What kind of coding did you do before the Iron Yard? I mean, did they require some kind of admissions exam? Did you do like free code camp or something like that to prepare?
Yeah, good question. I kind of skipped over that. So in the whole process of trying to figure out, is this a good path? I tried to teach myself for quite a while. So I did free code camp, which by far was the best resource I tried. And I also got a book to see if maybe like a written book would be good. But I think still at this point, free code camp is one of the best resources, if not the best, for people that are looking to try coding out. And so I did a significant amount of work, I'd say, on free code camp. But by the time I got to Coding Bootcamp, like it goes so fast that by the fourth week, we'd already like covered everything that I learned on my own. So but that's kind of the pre-work, for lack of a better term, that I did, even though it wasn't required.
That's funny because I think, for a lot of folks, and I always share this as a discouraging fact that's meant to be encouraging, that like teaching yourself how to program to the point of being able to get a job is not really a prescriptive process. Like you can't, like free code camp's awesome. I remember it was several years ago now, but I remember at one point, like no one had finished the curriculum, right? It was so big and there was so much stuff that no one had finished it. Cause either like they got to where they wanted to go before they finished it, or they ended up doing something different. So all to say, I think, a lot of people normally assume that, and I encourage everyone that can to start off self-teaching, but it's amazing whenever you're in like an immersive program, like how much quicker your learning actually happens than like what you can do on your own. Because, ideally when you get stuck, instead of spending a week in frustration, like it's a simple thing. You get unstuck pretty quickly. Okay. I cut you off. Keep going. All right. So you free code camp help prepare you. Then you realize that, hey, this thing is going to help me get there much quicker.
Yeah. And so we kind of dove in. As you know, it's very immersive. You're covering a lot. And so basically we went from nothing. I was actually just looking at my first ever website the other day. So our first assignment was to just build an ugly website with HTML and whatever CSS we knew. So I built like a ugly 90s themed Drake tribute website. And so we went from that all the way to learning React. At that point, we also learned Backbone, which I know is part of Parsley's curriculum, but we actually learned it and kept it in. So it was kind of a weird setup, but I don't think people really knew how to deal with React at that point. So we had Backbone models and also React.
What? Okay, I've heard people doing this. That was part of the Iron curriculum, to have backbone models with React?
Yes. And looking back, I was like, very strange, choice given what we know now. But that was kind of the stack that they taught. So
This sort of
yeah.
proves a theory of mine, though. Like when it comes to curriculum, I was talking with Brandon, who helps out here with support stuff, about curriculum changes at Parsity, and I'll be transparent and say that part of our conclusion was some of these curriculum changes don't matter that much, because you're telling me, you're a senior engineer, right? You went through a coding bootcamp. You're kind of the success story. You're telling me that the first thing that you learned as far as front-end development was to use React with backbone models. But the point is, you're learning to program, right? Like, and you're learning the fundamentals of front-end development, even if you're learning the wrong stuff, the outdated stuff, etc. In the end, it's so much less important, like the what of your learning than how you're learning it, and the processes that you're creating to solve problems and to research and to even evaluate that, like, hey, I'm learning this thing and it's wacky. That's the important part. So, okay, that's crazy. I never knew that.
Right. Yeah. And that's a great point, because I think the year before me, they taught Ember, and it was like weird Ember. Like, I think Ember 1, I can't quite remember because that's not my environment, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think the point is kind of learning to learn is the meta skill, and maybe the specific technology doesn't matter quite as much, because the guys that learned Ember before me, a lot of them stayed in Greenville. So I met some people, and they had to pick up new frameworks, pretty early on anyway. And so, yeah, I think really the skill is meta learning. And I remember talking to our instructors and being like, React is so hard. And I think my instructor was trying to challenge me a little bit. And he basically said, me and Joel, so the other teacher's name was Joel, Joel and I sat down and learned React in an afternoon just reading the documentation, though. And at that point, I remember thinking like, well, you guys are like good at this, but now that I'm 5 years in, I can see that I think his point was that they've learned at a certain point how to absorb new technology. And that's really the most important thing. So anyway.
That's awesome. Okay. We were following your path. Okay. So Iron Yard, front end, you're throwing together backbone with React.
Yeah. So I guess what I was saying was that we went from, nothing to not quite full stack, but it was an interesting, I know you and I were talking about requirements for final projects. We basically had a full stack requirement for our final project. So we had to have users that could be authenticated and log in, even though we hadn't learned any backend. So we used this Facebook product called Parse, which they shut down a few years later. But basically it was kind of like a Firebase. So that was kind of interesting to learn. But so we had, we went from nothing to having these essentially full stack final projects. And so, yeah, just learned a ton, obviously. And one cool thing that happened along the way was that for my final project, I had the opportunity to kind of partner with a local startup. And what that meant was basically use their API in my final project, and theoretically they could use my final project in their product, like bring it in as kind of a feature set one day. But I think that was kind of, a stretch goal. But for me, it ended up being really cool just getting to see a real company at work. It was only 2 people, but the lead developer was really, really good and helpful. And so by the end of it, I had, a solid portfolio, had some quote unquote real world experience, and was pretty well positioned, I think, to start applying for jobs. And then I kind of embarked on an interesting time. So I was really interested in working for a startup that was across the street from where the Iron Yard was at that point, and ended up getting some contract work with them. And then through that contract work, ended up learning that it wasn't going to be a good fit for me long term. And so I guess the quick overview there is they had kind of a web team that was building an internal web app for people to use. It was essentially, the premise of the company was that Medicare will reimburse you as a physician for following up with people that have long-term chronic illnesses, but they were essentially outsourcing it to this company, and the company was getting a cut of the Medicare reimbursement for doing this on behalf of doctors. And so the web team was kind of building the product for the people that were following up with patients. But I was on this other side where we were using Python scripts to remote into electronic health records and automate mouse clicks to download patient records,
gosh.
basically. And so not what I'd really gone to Coding Bootcamp for, right? And so I really wanted to do web development, not random Python scripting.
Yeah.
But it was good to see, like, it was another thing I learned was that the culture of this company was kind of very startup, very like go, a little bit toxic, I think. And so I realized I just didn't want to be there.
Yeah.
So I had already been applying for jobs and kept applying for jobs and took an approach that I kind of don't recommend that people take, which I call spray and pray, which is what it sounds like. And so really fairly indiscriminately applying in a bunch of different cities. So I was engaged at that point. And so my now wife and I kind of narrowed down like 8 cities. And so I was kind of looking all over, looking at all different kinds of companies, applying and not following up, not really trying to stand out. And I know that you advocate essentially the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And I advocate the opposite of that as well. And so basically just, not a terribly successful job search. I think it's already hard as somebody with no experience.
Yeah.
And so I think it is really important when you don't have formal experience yet to find some way to stand out. But I wasn't doing that. Thankfully, it ended up working out at a high level. I ended up getting hired here in Raleigh at the city government, like you mentioned, and that actually came through an Iron Yard connection. So the campus director here had posted in kind of a general Slack channel, like, hey, I know these guys, they're hiring.
Cool.
And I applied, ended up getting the job. And that's how I ended up here and ended up getting my kind of first full-time job.
So that wasn't a spray and pray job. That was
ironically, no. Yeah. So
a connection.
Yeah.
Because it's funny. I will admit that I think things have evolved even since 2016, or in my case 2013, 14, like from the arc of what it takes to get a job as a software engineer from a boot camp. And because I think at a time the spray and pray worked,
right.
Of like it was a numbers game. Like people are looking for junior engineers. There's just not many of them. They're interviewing computer science grads and realizing, oh, the computer science grads, a lot of them can't actually build software.
Right.
So we have to train them anyway. Why not take someone who can, from day one, they can at least maybe kind of contribute, maybe it's a 6-month onboarding instead of a year-long onboarding or something. But the misnomer I think that there is that people now think, oh, since you can't do the spray and pray, which is ultimately it's lazy, it's like, It didn't feel lazy. It feels like you're actually doing work because you're clicking apply like 1,000 times and like you're uploading your resume and that's annoying. But it's just busy work,
Right.
So, but I think what's happening is there are a fewer number of junior jobs that are posted. At least there are an abundance of bootcamp grads. And I think there's a lot of boot camps, to be honest, these days that are willing to, and it's been like that for a few years now, that are willing to say like, oh yeah, if you're going to pay $15,000, like we'll gladly have you as a student. So there's a lot of kind of, to be honest, second tiered people who probably shouldn't be coding, only not because they're not smart, but because it's not what they're passionate about, applying for jobs. And so now I think more than ever, the approach of you got to stand out. Not only do you have to do that, but it's going to be incredibly effective because no one's doing it, right? Because all the folks who are just doing the boot camp because, their cousin told them they should do this because they'll get rich,
right?
are doing the lazy method, to be honest. So, okay. So that was an aside soapbox item that you already mentioned, but so you got the City of Raleigh thing. What was that like interview process like? Did they grill you at all? I mean, did you feel like you were prepared for like kind of the technical aspect of all of it?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting question. And I guess before I answer, like, all due respect to my former colleagues there, but I'll just give my kind of unadulterated take. So the challenge with government jobs.
They're definitely listeners, by the way.
Yeah.
We have listeners far and wide. So
exactly.
I'm sure they're going to hear this.
Are you saying this isn't like the Tim Ferriss podcast?
A little different.
Yeah. That's funny. Okay, so basically the challenge that with government jobs that I think my boss was well aware of is that they are not sexy, which frankly I probably should have known at that point just from watching Parks and Rec, but I was a little bit kind of idealizing. I guess I'm pretty good at tricking myself, which is a weakness, and so I was kind of feeling like, well, maybe I'll be working on some interesting stuff potentially, but the reality is that essentially there were two main projects. One was kind of the external facing site, and then there was a big intranet, which is like an employee FAQ, basically like a big old employee resource thing. And they were both on Drupal. And the kind of exciting thing, quote unquote, which was necessitating a hire, was that the external facing site was going to get essentially a reboot. But with the way government works, it was just taking a really long time, and it took a really long time even after I was there. And so basically, all that to say, I think my boss knew that he was kind of, to a certain extent, disadvantaged because people aren't really going after local government jobs. People are going after, in our case, where we are geographically, the Cisco's, the IBM's, or a startup, something like that. And so what they were able to do was essentially like classify this job at the senior level in order to be able to pay more and compete in the market. But I'm guessing just based on what I know that the applicant pool probably wasn't super strong. And so I remember the interviews, I didn't feel like they went well, and there wasn't necessarily a ton of technical questioning. I think it was more just trying to get a sense of me as a person. And I think one thing I actually did do fairly well was represent myself as someone that was hungry to learn. And that's what I advocate essentially that most people do that are coming out of a boot camp, because you don't really have that much to offer otherwise. And so being able to learn is a huge asset at that point in anybody's career, I would say. And so essentially, to answer your question more directly, it wasn't super stringent technically.
Cool.
And it was kind of just like, it was very strange in retrospect. But it was more like, what do you think of our current website? Some technical stuff, very light, like what IDE do you use? Stuff like that. And so that's kind of how it went. Ended up getting the job.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think there is some, I wouldn't say misinformation, but there's some myths about, I think, where the bar is at for an entry-level position, and it's across the board. There's no standard of like where you have to be to land a job as a software engineer, right? I mean, there's some companies like what you're talking about where it's like, hey, let's talk about websites, and you're hired. And I remember one experience, we had a student who, and this was years ago, honestly, he was struggling in the program. And really before the program even ended, he got hired at the company that his mentor worked at as an engineer. And we were thrilled for him, obviously. And he was a hardworking guy. So it seemed like, hey, he can get there eventually. But I was a little surprised by how quickly they hired him. I remember talking to the mentor being like, hey, that's awesome that you hired him. We weren't honestly expecting him to get a job this quickly without doing a little bit more work. And basically what he said is, well, you should have seen the other applicants. Like, you wouldn't imagine that the people that we actually interviewed, like who we're talking to and how little they know. So I think that should just be like a little bit of an encouragement to folks that, whenever it says we need 2 years experience, like what does 2 years experience mean? 3 years, 5 years? Right. It really depends, like those are such nonsensical ways to doubt yourself or to exclude yourself from a job application, because who can quantify what that actually means, in terms of experience.
Yeah, exactly. I'm hoping at some point we move away from that, kind of in the same way that we've moved away from everyone being physically present in the same office. I kind of hope that job searching evolves away from that, because to your point, 2 years can be, if a person really puts in work, you can get a lot out of 2 years, or you can have 2 years experience and still not be able to do much. So it just really depends on the person, I think.
Well, this leads me to kind of your story a little bit, because to be honest, 2016 wasn't that long ago. And I'm just like, stalking your LinkedIn here. And you went from, I mean, you've got all kinds of titles thrown at you from different directions. It looks like you were senior web developer with Raleigh. Then you had a job as a principal software engineer. So those things also, by the way, are subjective, like what your job title is. But I think you would say, because right now you work for a little bit larger of a company, you are an actual senior engineer. Like if you were to go to another job, probably wherever you went, they would call you a senior software engineer. A couple questions there. Like, one, in your mind, like what made you go from junior or mid-level or whatever you want to call it to senior? I'll just start with that.
Yeah, so I'll do my best with this one. So varying factors. I think one, just being very transparent, the first time it happened in my last job, it was partly due to attrition, which is just a normal thing that I think people should be aware of. Like oftentimes senior engineers will leave because they're highly recruited. And kind of once you put that on your LinkedIn, my experience has been that the inbound is just kind of incredible if the hiring market is going well. And so it's just natural that people will leave. And so as more people leave, it kind of opens up those positions, and a lot of people just end up getting promoted from within. I'd say that's what happened the first time that happened to me. Not that I didn't deserve it necessarily, but kind of just looking around, it's like by nature, I had become one of the more senior people in the company just due to a lot of turnover. I had learned a lot at that point, it had been, I don't know, a year with them. And so I'd say it's a combination of, it was that I was on a very long-term project with the client at that company, and the client liked me. And so I think that probably had something to do with it. And then, I think I'd learned a lot at that company and had proven myself dependable and able to contribute. And so a mixture of factors as always, but I think that was kind of that situation. At my current company, a little bit different, I would say. So we have much better turnover. And so kind of what happened there was I was just able to learn a lot in my first year in my current job. And partly that's due to, we had some solid boilerplates with good defaults. And so I was able to like pick up a lot of patterns just from the way that we do things. That was really helpful. And then again, kind of to my point about getting your first job, just being a learner, being hungry to learn, I think goes a really long way. And so I was able to maintain that into this job. Partly it was due to the fact that I was just like so grateful for this job, because at that point, working remotely wasn't common, right? We forget this, but 2.5 years ago, it was like a diamond in the rough, almost like just kind of felt like winning the lottery. And I was so fired up to be at this company working remotely, and just was really hungry to jump in and contribute. And after about a year, that kind of led to this promotion. So I think a lot of times, kind of like I've been saying, it partly has to do with the environment you're in, but a lot of it has to do with you as well.
What do you think, now that you're kind of like in the thick of it, what are like the main differences between what makes a junior versus a senior?
Yeah, so I've actually been thinking about this. I just watched a video on it yesterday from my UFO, whose YouTube channel I really like. But essentially, the way that we say it at my current company is that a senior is a force multiplier. So essentially, anywhere you put a senior, any project you put a senior on, they're going to level the whole team up, is kind of the idea. And so I would say a lot of that comes down to impact. So the code base, features, velocity, production, all that kind of stuff, but also kind of more intangible stuff like helping to level up your colleagues. So I think a lot of that is helping people get unblocked, helping people write code in best practices. And so a lot of it, I think, comes down to autonomy and responsibility, basically, are kind of the two big words. So as a senior, I think you're more or less expected to be able to work on your own, unblock yourself for the most part. It's not to say that I never get stuck, but I think at this point, I've developed problem-solving skills to the point where I can more or less do most things on most projects on my own. The quality of the code you write, and then, like I said, kind of unblocking, mentoring, and leveling up the other people around you.
Do you think, one of the things I hear a lot from folks are that juniors don't have the experience working in a large code base, like be able to navigate like how what they're working on fits into the big kind of feature of it all. How much of being a senior depends on that versus just basically your like innate ability to find solutions to problems, if that makes sense. Like, are you a great senior because without anyone else's help, you can Stack Overflow it or read the code or problem solve? Or are you a great senior because you get the big picture of like what your app is doing and how your feature fits in?
I think it's got to be both. So it's a great point with the second example. I think some places where people that are maybe title level or junior fall a little bit short is not seeing that big picture.
Yeah.
And so something I didn't mention that you just reminded me of is that part of being a senior is also kind of having a vision and looking out ahead for seeing how features that are on the roadmap are going to come into play with what we're doing now, and not coding ourselves into a corner or taking on technical debt in ways that are going to hamper us down the road, being really involved with the project management. So that's a really important one, I think, because a lot of times we have this idea that software engineers are just supposed to kind of pull tasks off Jira and just do your task and that's it. But I personally am usually really involved with project managers and prioritizing things, defining things. And so that's a really big part of it as well, especially in an agency, I would say. I think agencies probably emphasize soft skills a little bit more. But yeah, you have to have both strategic thinking and tactical being able to get in there and debug something.
Yeah, that's probably true. I bet the agency work is really important because usually you're also might be interacting with the customer. So you have to understand from a product perspective, like what the product should do, I was looking back because I've been talking lately with quite a few like engineering managers, just kind of debating this whole conundrum of, hey, why don't you hire juniors? Oh, well, juniors are expensive. We have to invest in them. I was like, yeah, but our seniors, we don't want to pull seniors off projects to invest in juniors. My whole thing has been like, that's cool, but there's obviously a disconnect because I've rarely ever had to ask for mentors for our programs because seniors they're hungry to invest, into juniors. But one of the things I'm finding is a lot of companies don't necessarily do onboarding super well from a technical perspective of, I look back to my first junior job and I still probably couldn't tell you too much about the architecture of our product because we had, 3 or 4 other teams across the building doing other things. And at no point did someone, and I didn't ask either because I didn't know how to ask that question, but no one set me down and said, okay, here's some diagrams, we don't have to go technical here, but here's some diagrams of like their team does this, then it does this, and then this team does that. Like this is how the whole product works. And this is what you're working on. And, I did the thing where it's like, okay, if it's in Jira or whatever, I'm just going to pull it and start working on it. I don't know how it affects those folks or those folks over there, but it's like, wouldn't that be like onboarding 101 is to say, hey, this is the context of how your application is working. So anyways, I'm digressing, but I love all this. All right. So senior engineer, tell me a little bit, we talked about like tips and things for a while. You had, I don't know if are you still investing in your YouTube channel?
Yeah, I am actually. This is a huge achievement, but just hit 1,000 subscribers yesterday. What? I think. Yeah.
No freaking way! Congrats, man. Okay, so what? We're gonna put it in the show notes. But what's the easiest way to find your YouTube channel?
Yeah, if you just go to youtube.com/my name, Peter Elbaum, it'll take you to the channel. Yeah.
And what's been like your primary emphasis on like in this and your motivation for creating it and all that?
Yeah, so my emphasis is more or less, I would guess, the audience of this podcast. I'd say there's probably a high degree of overlap. So it's either people that are thinking about switching into a career as a software engineer or people that are kind of more early in their career. And the motivation was just wanting to start a YouTube channel in general. So being really inspired by people like Casey Neistat, et cetera. But also just wanting to share what I know. I really like this blog post called Learn in Public by this guy Swix. And basically the idea is like you are sharing things as you're learning And by doing so, you kind of are, number one, providing a lot of value to the world, but also number two, kind of indirectly building up a community. And so, yeah, I just wanted to be helpful, wanted to share what I know. And also part of the motivation is that it's high leverage, right? So I can mentor a bunch of students with Parsity, but I have to have a conversation with each one of them.
Yeah.
Whereas with a YouTube channel, I can make a video once and in theory it can be watched infinitely until the end of time. So that's also pretty appealing.
And it will be watched until the end of time.
We can hope.
Yeah, we can hope. Awesome, man. We'll have to start linking your videos for students. Yeah, on a side note, one of the things, this is more, I guess, like building in public, but on the note of learning in public, like I'm convinced that LinkedIn is a great platform for Coding Bootcamp students and grads. And actually one of the things that I'm going to try and implement. So I'm doing something starting on Saturday called Brand 30. And it's genius. There's this guy on LinkedIn. He basically created kind of this cohort-based challenge where you post a post every day on LinkedIn for 30 days. And he kind of teaches you how to write and how to define your audience, and basically how to build a personal brand, which is sort of what you're talking about with what you've been doing on YouTube. But I'm going to try and figure out how I can take away principles from that and just kind of inject it into Parsity. Cause why are students not taking advantage of learning in public, of where you can process what you're learning, reteach it. And in a lot of ways, when it comes to programming, some of the best teachers are those who know the least, ironically, because of the expertise gap. I even realized that, one of the things that I got good at early on was writing curriculum about stuff that I had just learned. So I've never been paid to write a React app. I've never been paid to write Node or Mongo or any of that stuff, right? I was kind of my software engineering life, as short as it was lived with Backbone and Rails. But I think I do a pretty good job because I just went through the process of learning it also. So I know the most common questions. So I love that. Okay. Back to your YouTube channel. We were going to talk about advice, and there's a large spectrum here of where you could be inputting advice for students, whether it's first deciding to do something like a boot camp, or it's landing a job, or it's advancing from being a junior to senior. But give me kind of whatever, a summary of your top kind of, I know we all have those soapbox things, but what's kind of one of your soapbox things that you stand on as far as advice goes?
Yeah. So something I end up talking about, what feels like a lot, and it sounds scary, but I think is important, is I tell people to embrace pain when it comes to learning to code, because I think we have this idea, kind of like you've been talking about, where it's oh, just go to this program and then just do it and then make six figures and you're at Google eating, free lunch and as much couscous as you want or whatever. And it's kind of not like that at all. And so, yeah, I just tell people to embrace pain. Number one, because it's hard to acquire the skill because you're fundamentally teaching yourself to think in a new way and think like a computer, and that doesn't come naturally to us at all.
Yeah.
But also because if your motivation is, oh, I want to get a job and be in this cool environment, that is not going to be enough to sustain you through the ups and downs of acquiring these skills. And so I think the more people can kind of, number one, embrace pain, but also be curious is kind of the other big thing I talk about. Those people go the furthest. The people that are kind of more interested in the superficial things, I think, tend to not do as well.
Yeah, no, that's great, man. I mean, and it's funny, I don't know, but it seems like somewhere along the way, people have bought into this idea that if you're going through a boot camp or a course, that the progression is just linear,
right?
And it's really not. There's high highs, there's low lows. I think the hardest part, and I've been kind of dealing with this with students who are in our prep course, they're learning JavaScript for the first time. So it's their first programming language. I think that's the hardest part of the entire journey, because I think at some point, if you really want to learn to program, it gets addicting, whenever you learn something new, you're like, whoa, that worked. I learned it. How incredible is that? You get addicted to it, but until you get over that first learning hump, which takes, if you're learning a programming language for the first time. You got to like learn all of every part of the language to do anything dangerous. So I had a guy email me the other day, and he was saying, I don't know if I'm cut out for this. And I got on Zoom and kind of digging into it. And it was basically because he was trying to say that though he understands all of the JavaScript lessons like in Codecademy, right now he can't build anything from scratch. And I was trying to explain to him, like, look, man, like that's the hardest chasm to jump across. You're basically saying like you want to be able to apply what you're learning immediately after learning it. I'm like, there are several steps in between there. And I think as you said, I think it's perfect. Like they're painful steps. Like there's no other way to go through it other than to screw it up, make mistakes, have error messages that you can't find, throw your computer, reach out in Slack, spend a night awake, doubting yourself, whether you're made for this, thinking you're an idiot, like dreaming in code, nightmare. Like all those things are reality for everybody. Literally everybody who's learned to code. If anyone tells you that that's not their experience, it's because they learned so young that they don't even remember and they just put it out of their mind. I promise you, like everyone's gone through that crap, So that's good. Embrace the pain. Okay, I want another tangent. What about like the job search? Like knowing what you know now, you've gone through the job search a few times. Like what's something that you wish you would have known, at different points in your own job searching processes?
Yeah, so a lot of this is probably colored by my last two jobs where I've been more involved in hiring people. So I feel like I have a view of the other side now.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's tough regardless, but I think any way you can stand out is good, more or less. So whether that's through a really specific cover letter, whether that's through reaching out to people at the company just to make a connection, whether that's finding the hiring manager on LinkedIn, anything you can do to distinguish yourself is going to be really helpful because, as you mentioned, there's just so much noise. Like I remember at my last job, we'd put up a posting and we'd get tons of applications and most just not that great. And so you end up having to just...
Like dozens or hundreds?
Not hundreds.
Okay.
But it kind of depended on, like, sometimes we just leave it up for a long time, but definitely dozens. And so, yeah, it's just trying to filter through. And if it's an engineer that's kind of doing this screening step, then you can be assured that they have a lot of other things going on, like writing code and trying to be productive. And so probably not going to be being super detailed into that first step. So anything you can do to grab attention and stand out is going to be really great. My programming teacher from the Iron Yard, the way that he applied for that job was he made a website specifically for that job application and wrote all these reasons why he would be a great teacher. And you can do that with something like Card, a simple one-page website that you don't even have to code up. And I think stuff like that goes a really long way. That's pretty low-hanging fruit and really not high effort. I'd say it's medium effort. But yeah, it really just at that first stage, especially when you don't have experience, is about standing out and getting the interviewer or the company's attention in some way.
That's awesome. I had never thought about that, like making a little single page site to kind of stand out. And I think, some of what, and again, coming back to like this, I guess, issue of people thinking they could just go to a boot camp and get a job is like that process sort of lacks creativity. I had one guy recently, and for some reason, I think this podcast is really appealing to bootcamp grads. So on LinkedIn, I've been connecting with and helping a lot of people that are not graduates of Parsity. And there's a guy reached out and he was asking for advice. And one of the things I was talking to him about was like, kind of building an audience or a network on LinkedIn. You should be posting. And he was like, what do I post about? And I was like, that one question, I don't mean like call him out on here, but that one question revealed so much about sort of his attitude and mindset, which is what prompted me to make this other post about attitude in the job search, which was like, I can't tell you, right? Only you know who you are, what makes you unique. You've got to have that confidence and you got to have the creativity to like make yourself stand out. So like, yeah, this idea, I would never have thought to create a website, but I'm sure that other people have ideas that I don't have, that if they're really hungry and they want to work there, you've just got to do the work of being creative and putting yourself out there and and risking failure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I love that. As we kind of wrap up here, Peter, what's something that you would be remiss not to share if we were to leave this podcast?
Yeah, interesting question. So I think this may be weirdly discouraging, but I've been doing a lot of kind of reflecting recently about just like the nature of all this and in careers and learning to code. And I think when I look back, it is really remarkable. Like if you told me 5 years ago when I was kind of getting started that this would be the trajectory, I might not have believed you. And I've just been so grateful for how things have played out. Like you said, not always linearly. Like I couldn't have guessed from my first job that I'd be where I am now.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, like, I don't know, I just have kind of been thinking that there's like more to life, in a lot of ways than career. And I felt like I put so much emphasis on, like I said, those first few years out of college, really trying to figure out what I was going to do and just working so hard. And hard work is great and all that, but now I'm kind of more thinking on a broader horizon. I think about like long-term things like relationships and family, and especially after the pandemic, just trying to figure out how work fits into all of that. And so I don't know, I think all this stuff is important. Obviously, learn to code for a lot of people has changed lives and opened up sources of income that wouldn't have been available otherwise, and has been a huge blessing for a lot of people. But I don't know. I think what I would tell myself, I'm not comfortable telling other people things on this necessarily, but what I would tell myself is just that there's more to life, and that this isn't necessarily an ultimate thing, even though it is good. And so that's kind of where my head is at right now, and where my mindset is, just trying to figure out kind of the bigger parts of life, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that so much. I think I'd be right there with you in that. And maybe like, as you mentioned, like the entire world thinks of the pandemic. I've been writing these little articles mostly for fun. I haven't like shared them on the internet, but they're on the internet. I just haven't like tried to promote them. One was called Radical Availability. And it's kind of cheesy, but it's just this idea that we would be, as people, like radically available for those in our lives that are close to us, whether it's like getting on a plane, moment's notice for like a wedding or a funeral, or being able to like be the guy who says, yeah, like I could do lunch. Like I'm not that busy at all.
Right.
We take busyness and make it such a status symbol of like you're wanted, you're desired, you've got value, but that's not where your value comes from. And I think ironically though, and we've talked about this idea of the one thing I was going to bring up was indie hacking. Mm-hmm. But the irony is that because the world has gone remote, though you could work more than you've ever worked before, you could also use technology to create, anything. It's insane, like the number of opportunities that you have to sort of put work in its place of like being something that's good, use your creativity, help people. But at the end of the day, one thing that I've always had for myself, and I'm sure you would agree with the same thing, is like as impactful as I could be with any kind of startup I'd ever start, is as many people's lives as I hope to change with Parsity. Like I'll never impact anybody more than I'll impact my wife and kids. Right. Like whenever 30 years from now, they're going to look back and most of the topic of their counseling sessions will be daddy,
Right.
But 30 years from now, my students won't be thinking about me, Right. So I love that idea. But okay. Yeah. Lastly, let's talk about indie hacking, because you kind of got me onto indie hackers. And I think for our audience, it's just cool to think about that a next step in your career. It doesn't even have to be like a fork where it's either or, right? But one next step in your career, besides just like climbing up the ladder of the engineering team, is not even like a startup founder. Like indie hacking is this really weird in between thing. Explain to me, like in your mind, what indie hacking is.
Yeah. So this is kind of a website, indiehackers.com, for anyone that's interested, that I found kind of by mistake when I was Googling Joel Hooks, who's the founder of Egghead, which is a great course platform, and randomly stumbled on this website. But essentially it is a community of people who are building more or less like independent software products, and not always just software, but sometimes like ebooks and courses and stuff like that. But I think the idea kind of arose in opposition to the traditional startup model, where you kind of start with an idea, you probably don't even have revenue yet, and then you take a bunch of venture capital funding, and then you're beholden to investors and you have to grow. Indie Hackers is kind of the opposite, where there's tons of people on this website that have started little software products, little SaaS apps, stuff like that are profitable, that kind of sustain their lifestyle, where they're not looking to take investment for the most part, and they're just working on these projects and just living their life. And to me, that's a lot more appealing. And I've kind of been bitten by the entrepreneurial bug for a long time, but I couldn't quite figure out like what is the right direction. And so I'd be on all these blogs, like Side Hustle Nation, for example, is one, but nothing ever really resonated with me, because it was like, start a local tours business or start a trash pickup business. And it never felt right to me, because it's like, well, I have technical skills. So what do I do with those? And when I found Indie Hackers, it kind of suddenly all made sense, and had been an avid listener of the podcast for basically 3 years now. And just really like this idea that, to your point, you don't have to necessarily get a job right after. I know most people probably will need to, but the point is, after you go through a boot camp, if it's a good boot camp, you have the skills at that point to more or less build anything you can think of. And so that's just very powerful. And so I guess my point is, consider what you can do to bring your ideas to life, and maybe some of those will be profitable and be able to sustain you.
Man, I love it. It's so cool. Yeah. Indie hacking, it scratched a weird, not itch that I'm having. I don't know necessarily it's something that I would do, but I thought it was just creative. I think a lot of times and this is true for the job search, everything else. Like we think about like what our options are, and we can only look at the paths that we're familiar with,
Right.
Whereas, I think what indie hacking does is it thinks about the problem and how can I be creative with the solution? In some ways the problem might be, hey, I want to be able to use my tech skills to create extra income. And yeah, that'd be fun for any developer, right? To be able to like code on your own project and to try to think of a niche. And I think there's even things in there that if you're on the job search as a bootcamp grad, like build software,
Right.
you can do that. And it doesn't have to be like a fake side project where you build something just for fun for your portfolio. Like, maybe it's not gonna be successful, but try to make it real. Like, how much more important is that? And like get an LLC, spend $100 on LegalZoom to get an LLC and try to set up a business. And while you're searching for jobs, and who knows, you may never make $1, but it's a real project versus, some random side gig thing that you threw up online.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome, man. All right, Peter, we're going to link to your YouTube video in the show notes. Any other places that you should be found?
I'm on Twitter as well, which is big in tech community. I'd recommend anybody that's trying to build a network also go to Twitter, because that's where people tend to hang out. And it's just Peter Elbaum on Twitter. So you can also find me there. Feel free to DM me, and happy to give advice or my thoughts on anything if I can be helpful.
Awesome. I think I said YouTube video, but I meant channel, because you have more than one video. Right?
More than one video. Unfortunately, it takes a ton of videos to build any traction.
That's awesome, man. All right, Peter. Well, thanks so much, man. I appreciate you being part of it.
All right. Thanks, Aaron.
All right, as we wrap things up here for this episode of the Develop Yourself podcast, another reminder that this Friday, November 26th, is our early deposit deadline. You'll get $500 off tuition. That is, if you're accepted to the program, you can hold your spot. You'll get us in your corner. We'll do everything we can to make sure you're as prepared as possible for our January program so that your transition to becoming a software engineer is as smooth as possible. Anyway, we're going to have a link here in the show notes. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions that you might have. And until next time, this is the Develop Yourself podcast.